All right, ESPN's Tom Luginbill is with us. He joins us each week on the JohnstonRVCenter.com, presented by ATIX, AAATix.com. All those hard-to-find basketball tickets like Bama Gonzaga Saturday at ATIX, 822-7382 or AAATix.com. What is up, Luke? How are you?
Good morning, guys. Hey, I've got to ask you a question. I don't understand why I haven't asked it so far to this point, but what's this mystery fifth hour, and how have I never been a part of it?
You're welcome to join. We generally don't do guests there. I'll give you a brief history. When we used to do a 4-hour radio show, we used to joke going off the air, hey, tune in for the extra hour, the mystery fifth hour. Barack Obama, Tiger Woods, and Bill Clinton are going to be our guests. Or tune into the mystery fifth hour. Prince Charles is going to do an entire hour-long sit-down with us. I mean, just goofing off. And people were like,
right?
Hey, where did I hear that Tiger Woods interview? I'd like to hear that. So we just kind of made it a running joke, and then we decided at one point to do a non-sports podcast, absolutely no sports allowed. And what would we call it? And we're like, well, we always joke about the Mystery Fifth Hour. Let's just call it that. So it continues to live.
So it's basically movies, television shows, booze, pop culture, Floribama.
Yep.
Bad choices, good choices.
Anything but sports.
We were really shouting back at management who, for a brief period of time, we'd lost an hour. We were back to 3 hours. So really it was that extra hour, that mystery hour. We were sort of upset that we only had 3. So we were joking about that 4th hour.
Yeah, and look at it. We'll throw.
You barking at the bosses.
We had 2 topics yesterday, and we'll throw one at you. And the best movie trilogy of all time.
The best movie trilogy of all time.
I went Caddyshack.
There's only
been 2, so
I'm joking.
Actually, I don't even think you answered.
So I went Godfather, Brown Dogs out 3, and I know 3 wasn't great, but 1 and 2 are outstanding. 2 of the top 10 films of all time, probably 2 of the top 5 films of all time, and 3 was decent enough for me to have that combination and put it over the top.
So clearly, we can't have Star Wars here, and we can't have Indiana Jones.
Yeah, Indiana Jones got.
There's 4 Indiana Jones, and there's going to be the 5th.
That's 4. So you can't have that. Well,
then
it's easy. It's the Dark Knight trilogy. It's not even close.
I'd say that came up. Yes.
And what about Lord of the Rings?
No, stop it. I mean, how long does it take a guy to slide down a mountain for 35 minutes? The little hobbit was rolling around down that mountain. You remember that one scene? It's like, all right, dude, get him to the bottom of the freaking mountain.
The little hobbit was rolling around.
This science fiction fantasy story is not believable.
I can't do Star Wars.
No, it's crazy. I mean, where we draw lines on things, because you obviously love Star Wars. I love Game of Thrones, but I can't stand the Lord of the Rings stuff.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm not into the whole lore. It's just too long. It's too convoluted. And I got to be honest with you, it took me a while to get back into the Game of Thrones thing, because the first time out, there was just so much going on. It was too much of a thought process. It was too much work, and I'm not that bright. So I was like, I've got other things to do. And then I finally went back to it, and I was glad I did, because I loved it. But that's what I like about House of the Dragon is there's no confusion. Like, you know exactly who everybody is right away.
Okay, so random comment I made. We were talking about Grayson McCall. We know he's in the portal now.
Yeah.
And there's going to be so much attrition out of the SEC at the quarterback position. And I said, I believe if Grayson McCall, we'll use Auburn as an example. He decides to transfer to Auburn and play for Hugh Freeze. Can you make the argument the best quarterback, at least going into 2023, might be Grayson McCall in the SEC?
Yeah, potentially. Obviously, we're going to have Jaden Daniels in that conversation.
Will Rogers.
At LSU. If he wants to come, that's right. Will Rogers. But as far as like the total package of what the guy brings, I think it's more than fair. Now, you talk about a steep learning curve of an uptick in talent. But I think, to be honest with you, I'll throw another guy out there. We might have said this last week. I think if you said the same thing about Spencer Sanders, it's a guy that's almost thrown for 10,000 yards that could come into the league. If he was in any type of spread version of the offense, he could be really, really good. So I think there's going to be some great quarterback options out there for programs in the SEC, not just Grayson McCall or Spencer Sanders.
4 to 5 stars or more 1 week from National Signing Day. If you flip over the next 7 days, is that great recruiting, or do I just assume now you got a better NIL deal?
Probably you got a better NIL deal, to be honest with you. Right, wrong, or indifferent, people can disagree with that. They can debate me on it. That's fine. But I know what these conversations are like now. I've had them with the coaches and what their conversations are. The initial conversation when a kid's 15 years old and the conversation now. Unfortunately, this is what it revolves around. And that's not any different than the transfer portal. It's the exact same thing as how the transfer portal is being used with the help of name, image, and likeness. I think the one thing as we lead up to signing day, guys, and not necessarily with the player that's got 30 committable offers, he's going to have a place to land. But if you're a lower end 4-star or a 3-star or a 2-star guy, and you've got some scholarship offers that are committable, don't screw around. I'm telling you, do not screw around, because there are so fewer scholarships to go around right now. And the transfer portal is playing such an instrumental role in the decisions that these coaches are making with their roster that you don't want to be left without a chair when the music stops. And there's going to be a lot of guys that could find themselves in that position.
Tom Luginbill, the criminally underused Tom Luginbill. He's only got one bowl game, but it's a good one. Tom Luginbill with us on the Johnston. He may not want more. I don't know. JohnstonRVCenter.com hotline. He's presented each week by ATIX, AAATIX.com, or 822-7382. Bama Gonzaga, Auburn, Georgia State tonight. Also, that bowl game that Luginbill is doing is the Sugar Bowl, Alabama, Kansas State. I don't know that you can gauge. That's a place you can get tickets, by the way, ATIX, if you want to go to that one. I don't know if you can gauge what to expect out of this Alabama team, Luginbill. We don't even know who you're going to see on the field for that game.
Well, we're going to have to figure out who the wideouts are going to be.
No doubt.
That's for sure, to start off that conversation. Still don't know, in regards to Bryce Young and Will Anderson and maybe a handful of others, what the bowl outlook looks like for them. What we do know is that we will have a very hungry, blue-collar, chip on the shoulder, everybody on the roster suiting up to play a Kansas State football team in that game. And I think, and I'm sure Coach Saban, and we'll talk to him as we get closer to the game, but I'm sure, he's very concerned about the mental and emotional approach that his team takes when it comes to having an appreciation and a care for how privileged it is to play in a Sugar Bowl. I know it's not the college football playoff, but are you mature enough to focus, prepare, and perform to your standard, regardless of the opponent and regardless of the bowl invitation? And Alabama's had trouble with that in years past. And I thought the last time I had Alabama in a bowl game outside of the college football playoff, which was Michigan and Alabama in the Citrus Bowl, Alabama came to play. And, I think that's the expectation this time around, because you're going to get a team in Kansas State that won't beat themselves. They don't make mistakes, likely not to turn the ball over heavily, and they'll play good in the kicking game. So Alabama will have their hands full. I think this is going to be a really, really fun matchup.
You mentioned Alabama and the unknown at wide receiver, and I think people were blown away, Luginbill, with the decade of elite wide receivers and how much the drop was this year. When you look at this roster, I know there might be talented guys, but it's just hard to believe on what we saw this year that you're going to have some elite guys step up next year.
Yeah. It's so much like Clemson at the wide receiver spot right now. It's almost like we become so conditioned and really spoiled at the level of play and the level of productivity, and not just from one guy, but 2 guys, 3 guys, sometimes 4 guys on the same roster at the same time. And then all of a sudden, you maybe don't have that same replacement guy, that same plug and play guy, and then the production drastically wanes, and it's a little bit more difficult to move the ball through the air. Your explosive plays are limited. You've got a guy like a running back in Jahmyr Gibbs that kind of becomes the focal point of your passing game. We haven't seen that from an Alabama team, maybe ever. And so these young guys on this roster, those that chose to stay and not go into the transfer portal, they've got to grow up. They've got to get developed. They've got to emerge and become the go-to guy, become the playmaker, the guy that's going to make a difference. And we haven't quite identified that, or they haven't quite identified that. Will that potentially come in recruiting from the high school ranks? Will that potentially come in recruiting once again from the transfer portal? Is there a potential Jameson Williams out there? And I, If it's an upgrade, you bring him in. If it's not, you think twice about, going to the high school ranks. But certainly something that's been pretty glaring considering what we experienced over the last really 8 to 10 years at that position for Alabama.
Listen, initial reaction is not always the correct reaction because you can be emotional. You could be your mood could be sort of flat that day. But we didn't seem overwhelmed with Hugh Freeze's hire at coordinator when we announced him on the show here. But from a guy who knows football, a national guy, what do you think of Philip Montgomery as an offensive coordinator? How do you see him fitting in with Hugh and calling plays and building that offense at Auburn?
Well, cut from the same cloth. And then obviously a distinct background under Art Briles, who has a high school background just like Hugh Freeze does. And that offense and what it morphed into and the ability to have prove that you can have a power run game in a wide open spread offense that of course wants to throw the football, but at the core of the offense, it's run game. And so anybody who's been an offensive coordinator, has been a quarterback coach, a highly successful quarterback coach, he was RG3's quarterback coach, and then that person has been a head coach, there's a lot of experience and ideas and X's and O's in a variety of different approaches that only lend to a better product, in my opinion. The more experienced you are, the more experiences you've had with different levels of football, the group of five versus the power five, being a coordinator versus being a quarterback coach versus being a head coach and having to run your own program, especially at a place like Tulsa where you don't have, a ton of available resources. It's a hard job. And so I kind of like it. Now, who's going to call the offense? I don't know. Is it going to be a combination of the two? Is it going to be Philip Montgomery? Is it going to be Hugh Freeze with the aid of Philip Montgomery's input? That remains to be seen. I just love the experience level in the building from an offensive perspective.
ESPN's Tom Luginbill, presented by ATEX 822-7322. Your best Mike Leach story is what?
I don't have a ton of them. Obviously, I've had several of his games, and I've interviewed him several times. I think one of the things you always appreciate about him is he's never consumed about football, right? It was never about the pressure of winning. He had experiences outside of life. And so anybody who knows me knows that I'm a cowboy boot, belt buckle type of guy. And I had Washington State and USC in the Coliseum several years back. And, Coach Leach is always out there pretty early. He's got his little styrofoam cup, which everybody always wondered what was in the styrofoam cup. And then and I was walking out to just greet him and say hello. And he kind of looks at my waistline, and I happen to have a Schlitz belt buckle on. Immediately he goes, Schlitz? Oh, man, I haven't had a Schlitz in years. This quickly morphed into a 30-minute conversation where I was thoroughly enlightened and educated upon a variety of different bygone era beers, Olympia, Old Style, all of these types of, and he's giving me the history on all of them, right? And so just a wonderful conversation. Well, it just turns out that about 4 or 5 weeks later, I get them again, this time in Pullman. And of all the things coaches have going through their minds, I walk out onto the field in pregame warmup. He immediately looks at my waistline and he goes, PBR? Pat's Blue Ribbon? Where's the Schlitz buckle? Like he remembered it. And then he goes into a whole conversation about a whole nother line of beers. And we're, an hour and a half from kickoff. It's just, I don't know, man. Everybody's going to miss that. Everybody's going to miss those conversations that those of us were fortunate enough to have with him. And I think the one thing, too, that everybody needs to realize about him is how intelligent he was. When you're having a conversation with him, he's looking at you, but he's looking through you. And it wasn't because he was losing his train of thought or that he was not paying attention. He's 3 steps ahead of you, man. He was on to the next conversation, the next topic. Where could this go? I think it's also one of the reasons why he was such a good play caller.
Well, it was highly debated whether or not he was a good coach. I was always on the side. I felt like he was a good coach because I looked at the 3 jobs he had, Luginbill, and they were all average jobs from Lubbock to Pullman to Starkville. And, just put into words the accomplishment of winning 11 games in Lubbock and 11 games in Pullman.
I think there's an element to this that people gloss over, and that is he's the perfect coach for an outlier job, right? An outpost location. Nobody messes with him. He pretty much answered to himself so he could be his quirky, authentic self without receiving a ton of criticism, even if things weren't going overly well. not big power brokers and all of those sorts of things. And then he comes back into the SEC after being at Kentucky in an assistant's capacity. You know, to sustain winning at the level he sustained it with that offense was something that Hal Mumme could never do at the Power 5 level. It was done at the lower tier levels, Iowa Wesleyan, Valdosta State. A lot of people don't realize that Mike Leach was an offensive line guy. He wasn't a quarterback guy. He wasn't a wide receiver guy. If there was a criticism of the air raid of this offense, and I think it's a fair one, is it's a difficult offense to win a championship with because of the inability to effectively and consistently run the game football all the time, or at least consistently to offset the passing game. When you play in Alabama or an LSU or an Ohio State or a Clemson or somebody, you generally get outmanned up front and you become one-dimensional. I think that's a fair criticism. But I will say this, since the height of the wishbone and the veer and the triple option of the 70s and 80s, no other offense has had an impact on today's offensive football more so than the air raid. And there's very few coaches that you can say that about.
All right, he is ESPN's Tom Luginbill. You can see him on Bama, Kansas State. Many of you will be watching that game. You'll get Luginbill there. We always appreciate the time, Lugs. Have a great week.
Absolutely, guys. Have a great week.
All right, buddy. You too, Luginbill, with us on the JohnstonRVCenter.com, presented by ATEX. JohnstonRVCenter.com hotline, presented by ATEX. 822-7382, AAATEX.com.